Next on KQED Newsroom, save water or get hit in the wallet. Fines being discussed for wasting water as the drought intensifies, and dry conditions get fire season roaring to an early start. Plus, pulling the curtain off healthcare prices. It's not as easy as it sounds.
It's virtually impossible for consumers to find out the price of something in advance of a treatment.
Good evening and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. California is struggling with its worst drought in decades as state lawmakers debate a multi-billion-dollar water bond. Californians have cut water consumption by only 5%, not the 20% Governor Jerry Brown called for in January. The State Water Resources Control Board is targeting outdoor water use and threatening fines of up to $500. The recent high temperatures and dry conditions are cooking up a fierce fire season. In just the past 2 weeks, wildfires have flared from Napa to Southern California. All were quickly contained, but concerns remain high as drought conditions intensify. All these elements joined together create a vexing political and environmental scenario. Here to discuss the impact are Tom Vacar, consumer editor for KTVU News, Scott Detrow, KQED Sacramento bureau chief, and Paul Rogers, KQED Science Managing Editor and Environment Writer with the San Jose Mercury News. Paul, starting with the latest drought update, how much power do Governor Brown and the State Water Resources Control Board realistically have to mandate conservation?
Not as much as you might think, actually. There are really 3 levels of water conservation that any city can do. And so those basically are voluntary water conservation rules, which are in place in most places in the Bay Area now. And that basically means sending a little insert with your bill, putting some stuff on their website where they say, please don't hose down the driveway. Please use a nozzle if you wash your car. Really basic things like that. Please don't run the faucet all night into the street. The next level is mandatory conservation, and that means if you do any of these wasteful things, we're going to send someone over and write you a ticket and fine you. The third level is rationing, and that's happening almost nowhere in California, except for a few places like Pleasanton and Santa Cruz, where every household gets a budgeted amount of water, and if you use more than that, you pay big fines. And so what the governor and basically his Water Resources Board is expected to do on Tuesday is vote for the second level, which is to say we're forcing every city to do these mandatory rules. But the devil is in the details. Cities don't have to hire so-called water cops to go out and write tickets for violators. They don't have to fine people $500 if they don't want. The state law says they can fine them up to that. They don't have to. They can give you warning tickets. They don't even have to.
There's no teeth, it sounds
That's right.
like.
There's no teeth in it. And a big part of the problem here is that Jerry is upset, and noticeably so, because he wanted a 20% reduction, as you said in the open. He's so far only gotten 5%. Most people in the Bay Area and LA are not feeling this drought yet, even though farmers are getting hammered. And Brown is very worried that if the El Nino that we're hoping for this winter fizzles out like it's starting to, we could have a 4th year of drought, a 5th year, and then you get into emergencies where we don't have enough water for firefighting, for hospitals, to run the sewage systems. Yeah. So he's thinking, look, we're doing a bad job now. We got to save more now for later.
But here's the problem. I was talking to East Bay Mud, and they say, look, we can't ask for too much more because we're using essentially the same amount of water that we did 20 years ago with a lot more population. So people have reduced their consumption by more than 20%. Now you're coming to them and you're saying, do it even more, and they're saying that realistically it's very hard for a water company to do that because they know that people mostly are trying to do exactly that.
Nonsense. And that's, I know that's not your argument, that's their argument. When we have seen places like Pleasanton and Santa Cruz say, we want 25% reductions and we're going to fine you. In Santa Cruz, for every 1 unit of water you use above your allotted amount, it's $50. So your water bill could be $500 or $1,000. They have 94% of the households in Santa Cruz now cutting back 25%. East Bay Mud is cutting back 10%. San Francisco's cutting 1% from last year. San Jose is cutting 4%. So basically what's happened is, because there's no teeth in these things, even though East Bay Mud is correct that we, over the last 30 years, have done a good job putting in low-flow toilets and using the same amount of water, there's a lot more savings that could be had. And the reason these cities and water agencies don't want to do this is because they lose tens of millions of dollars in revenue. It's a terrible political thing for them. They sell less water, so they have their fixed costs still, right? They still have to pay all the employees. And then, to make it up, they have to raise your water bill. So you get penalized, they get yelled at. The thing is a nightmare, and they really are just kicking and screaming to not have to do these mandatory rules.
So when the hit in the wallet obviously is heavy enough, people will cut back. But the other side of this too is that with the drought dragging on the way it is, the fire season is starting earlier. Vegetation is so dry. I mean, the kind of dry vegetation we're seeing now, Tom, is what we normally wouldn't see until mid-August at least.
Exactly. I was talking to some pilots that fly the tankers, and they say this is the stuff you see in late August, September. They say that's the dry fuel level. Dan Berlant up at the CAL FIRE PIO there, he said, look, you know, this is as bad as it's gotten in many, many decades. I checked their latest numbers. As of the 7th of July, these are the most recent numbers, we've had 2,990 fires. That's 16 fires a day. Last year, we had 2,667, 14 fires a day. The 5-year average is 2,101. That is 11. So we've got 5 more fires every day, and every one of those fires, on top of the original set, have the potential for getting wildly out of control. And one of the reasons we've probably seen less acreage burn this year, because it actually has been less acreage burn, and there's so many more people on the fire lines doing the fighting that they're actually able to do a better job. But the reality of the situation is we're seeing more fires than we've seen in maybe ever.
And we're still early on in the fire season.
And that's coming after a winter where they never really had a break compared to the typical season, right?
Right. In Southern California, there are many districts down there, CAL FIRE districts, that are now just 24/7, 365 days a year on full alert. There's no fire season down there. And the farther north you get, there's still fire season, but the fire season is getting longer and longer because of the drought.
Scott, let's turn to the politics of the drought for a moment. How is this affecting the water bond that's on the November ballot?
There's a big effect on it. There is, to give a little bit of context, there's this $11 billion bond that was initially passed in 2009 that's already sitting on the fall ballot waiting to be voted on. But all the politicians in Sacramento view it as a stinker. They think that it's too expensive and it would fail if it went up for a vote. What they want to do is take that off the ballot and replace it with a smaller bond. And they want to get something on there because they feel like in a drought season, it's the type of electorate that would say, you know what, we should be spending more money on water projects and we're going to approve this. But the problem is that these bonds require a 2/3 vote to get passed. So you need to have lawmakers from both sides on board with it because Democrats don't have that supermajority anymore due to some ethical issues that we've discussed in other shows.
Senator Leland Yee, for example.
Exactly.
But also they're not able to get 2 Republicans over to their side for that 2/3 majority.
That's right, and they're working on it. There are 2 real issues here. Well, there's 3 real issues, because one is the cost. Governor Brown says he doesn't want to go above $6 billion. Now, both the Assembly and Senate have much more expensive plans that they'd like to see passed. And the other sticking point is that a lot of Central Valley lawmakers from both parties, as well as Republicans, want to see a lot of money spent on what they call surface storage, things like new dams, new reservoirs. Democrats, environmentalists that have other priorities, environmental restoration, things like that. So there's an argument over how much to spend on dams and things like that. The line that supporters want is $3 billion. But if it's a $6 billion bond, liberals don't want to spend half of that on things they don't like.
Well, then it's almost impossible, realistically, to build a dam in California, to build a reservoir in California, because there are going to be so many environmental arguments, so many ways to stop that, it virtually becomes impossible to do it now.
And so the environmental groups, they want to put more money for water conservation, where the water districts say, if you buy a low-flow toilet, we'll give you $100. They want more money for those types of programs, more money for recycled water, more money for what they call conjunctive use, or storing water in the ground. And the big question, and I'm curious what Scott thinks about this, is whether the Dems will be able to peel 2 Republican voters away for some kind of compromise, or whether the whole Republican Party is just going to say, our way or nothing, and potentially come away with nothing.
Right, and let's keep this in mind. Because of the way that the budget has shifted, so it's just a simple majority vote to pass a budget, and because of the big losses Republicans have suffered in so many elections, it is very rare for Republicans to have relevance and to have clout in Sacramento. So a lot of the Republicans, especially in the Senate, have to be thinking, this is a moment where we can really assert ourselves and get some of our priorities through. And they've made it clear their priority is more of this surface storage money. There's another dynamic as well, and that has to do with the controversial tunnels in the Delta.
Is there a correlation? I was wondering about that.
Yes and no. Like most environmental policy things and state finance, it's a complicated issue. There's no direct money for the tunnels in this project. That's being funded by another source. But in order for the tunnels to go forward, they're going to have to spend a lot of money restoring the Delta, spending money kind of making up for the fact that this construction would harm some wildlife. So opponents of the project are targeting the restoration money that's in this bond, which is about $500 million at this point in time. They're thinking that if they can scale that back or restrict its use, they might have a chance at slowing down the tunnel. So there's kind of a proxy battle going on right now over Delta restoration funding.
I want to also bring up the issue of food prices. We've got the politics, and now we've got the consumer issue that is being brought up. And the drought is already driving up some food prices. Poultry, dairy, you name it.
Yeah, it's doing all of that. And certain things yet have to be affected. That's what really surprised me. Root vegetables have yet to really seriously be affected. But melons, tree fruit, big increases, and looks to be even a lot more. And with all of the other, like the almond trees being pulled out of the ground, even if it starts raining again, it's going to take years to replace some of the 5 million acres that are out of production right now. So food prices going up is not going to be something terribly unusual. And while there probably is in the world market, like in Mexico, plenty of food to come in, it's going to cost more because it costs more to ship it here.
Well, give us an idea of how much more it's gone up already.
Well, I can tell you that meat is up 5.5% to 6.5%. Poultry's up 5 to 6%, and most of the produce that we think of is up 3 to 4%, and that's just with what we have right now. Nobody knows if it gets worse where that's going to go.
And in the meantime, there's now food aid to agricultural workers in the Central Valley, some of the areas hardest hit because employment is on the rise there because of the drought.
Well, you know, it's interesting. One of the things going to come from this, though, which I think is very positive, is a lot more technology is going to come to bear. A lot more people are currently working on technology. It's amazing the amount of technology that's already out there. For example, home watering systems that sense whether or not the ground really needs to be watered at that point in time. So a lot of these technologies will come into the fore, and while we're going to pay a heavy price for what's happening right now, eventually a lot of those technologies, like when we put in low flow toilets and shower heads and all that stuff, will actually pay off in the long run, but in the short run we're in trouble.
And this is a really important point, because agriculture in California uses 80% of the developed water, meaning all the water that people use. And so the majority of acres in California, planted acres, do not have drip irrigation. They've caught up a little bit, they're doing a better job, but there are enormous potential gains to be had, and with drip irrigation you can cut water use 30–40% per acre, and it's a lot cheaper to put drip irrigation in than to build billion-dollar dams.
One other thing which is important, I did a story with East Bay Mud about smart meters. They're testing smart water meters. What's amazing about this is this will tell you literally down to the minute what your water use is. If there's a leak, like if you see that you're using water at 2 o'clock in the morning, nobody's getting up to go to the restroom or something like that, there's a leak. You can detect this stuff, and it gives people a chance to manage their water in a way as never before. I know there's controversy about smart meters in general, but this could be a huge thing if we are willing to spend the money to equip houses with smart meters, and then if people are willing to follow the advice the smart meter gives them.
So I'm hearing a lot of piecemeal solutions here. What do we need to do, though, as a state, policy-wise, to really prepare for future droughts in the long term, and not just addressing this one drought?
My thought, and I've been thinking about this as we talk about these preliminary steps and these suggestions, and here's how you can cut back on water. It seems to me that this is one of these things that, like so many things in life, people don't do things unless they're forced to. People don't do things unless they're really going to get a fine. People don't do things unless they feel like, oh my gosh, I'm going to run out of water now. So I wonder if we're going to have to delay and maybe wait until that second or third or fourth year where it really is dire, to see some of this behavior change. And I'm wondering if we're going to have to wait for the state to take that next step and talk about that last stage that Paul was mentioning before, in terms of like really aggressive pushes to stop using water.
And we've seen this play out in other developed countries. I mean, Australia had a 10-year drought, a really terrible 10-year drought that just ended a few years ago. They cut their per capita water use dramatically, like 2/3. They built 6 massive desalination plants. I mean, there are a lot of myths in California. One is that population growth is driving water demand. It's actually not. Like I said, 20% of all use is all businesses, all 40 million people is 20% of the water demand.
The rest is agriculture.
The rest
80%.
is ag. And the big cities of California, LA, San Jose, these other places are using, as Tom mentioned, the same amount of water that they used 30 years ago. You know, with conservation, you can keep doing better. The kind of reforms that we need are things like groundwater reforms, where there's no rules at all on pumping groundwater on farms or cities. We're over pumping, we're sinking the land, and that's our water in the bank for future years. And Governor Brown is trying to pass big reforms on that, and that would be historic.
As
if
we tell people when we talk about, finances and consumer things, diversify. Don't bet on any one thing. Don't bet on the Sierras. Don't necessarily bet on, conservation alone. We have to look at desalination. We have to look at all of these other things so that we have a whole plate of things in front of us, and then we can pick the best and least expensive as we need it. But to just rule out things entirely or say we're not going to try that because it may potentially be more expensive and people may not use it, if you took that attitude, then we should never buy a fire truck, because we don't use them all that often. But if we didn't have them, we'd be sorry we didn't. And diversity is what's going to save us.
All right. And in the meantime, the drought goes on. 80% of California is now in what's considered an extreme drought condition. So thank you all for joining us. Scott Detrow, KQED Sacramento Bureau Chief, Tom Vacar, KTVU Consumer Editor, and Paul Rogers, KQED Science Managing Editor. Well, we all want the best prices when we shop, right? If you're looking for a computer, a new car, or just about anything else, it's pretty easy to find the price range after a quick web search. But for healthcare, forget it. It's well known to health policy types, but less so to consumers, that the healthcare marketplace lacks transparency when it comes to cost. It's hard to know whether you're getting a fair price or paying through the nose for a procedure like a mammogram or an MRI. KQED is stepping into this void with a new project called Price Check. Scott Shafer talked earlier with Lisa Aliferis, editor for KQED's State of Health blog.
So, Lisa Aliferis, what's the deal with the healthcare market? Is it just fundamentally different than other markets?
Pretty much. So it's virtually impossible for consumers to find out the price of something in advance of a treatment. You can call around. I mean, people have described calling a hospital. They're going to have some procedure, and they get shuttled from place to place to place. Nobody can give them a straight answer. So
why is that? I mean, is it there's just a lack of transparency built into the system somehow?
It's a lot of it is the way traditionally that healthcare has been covered in this country. Originally, we had an indemnity insurance plan system.
What does that mean?
So that means that you would pay, as the consumer, you would pay 20% of whatever was charged. So then there would be an incentive to have a higher and higher charge, because insurers would pay 80% of that, you would pay 20%. Then we've had this transition to HMOs, but in the meantime, insurers negotiate directly with employers. Employers don't get to know what insurers are negotiating with providers, what those costs are. So it's really an opaque marketplace.
So that raises a good question. If someone is paying out of pocket for, say, a mammogram, they're going to have a different price than, say, someone who went through Kaiser and may not even have seen a bill, right? That
is correct. So that's the other. Kaiser is a closed system. People in general pay a premium and all their care is covered. Someone else may get their explanation of benefits. If you're insured, you've probably seen these forms, a description of what your insurer covered. You look at the form and there are probably numbers all over it that are a little hard to decipher until you really sit down and pay close attention to it. And yes, self-pay prices are different, and often the highest price that might be paid.
And so lack of transparency, Price Check is aiming what, to break through that?
So we've launched this new project, Price Check. So it's KQED in collaboration with KPCC. They're our NPR affiliate in the Los Angeles area, and a New York City startup, Clear Health Costs. And so what we're doing all together is sampling prices on a very narrow number of procedures across California. Clear Health Costs has called in the Bay Area and in the Los Angeles area to get these cash or self-pay prices for mammograms at a handful of places, a handful of imaging centers or hospitals. And we're asking people to submit what they themselves have paid, because we want to see the range of prices charged and paid around the Bay Area and statewide.
And give us a sense, what are you hearing, what are you seeing so far in terms of the range of price for a mammogram? So
it's very early, but initially, just as we started, we had these self-pay prices. Now those ranged from, in the Bay Area now, from $125 at one imaging center all the way up to $801. Now in the interim, we've had women submit some of their bills of what they've paid. And one woman reported that she was charged $1,500. Her insurer paid $1,200. She paid $300. Now, we're a little confused by this, and this gets into the crowdsourced nature of the data, because screening mammograms, that is to say the mammogram that women are recommended to get every other year or every year, depending on whose guidelines you're looking at, that those are supposed to be covered at no copay.
And this is under the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. And so you're finding what, that that's not the case, or women are going outside the network to get a provider they prefer?
So it could be that this woman went outside of her network and the copay was different. It could be, there are lots of reasons why. Yeah. But we're just trying to see what the variation is.
And what is there an explanation? Is there a good explanation for why there would be such a wide range of prices?
In some cases, it may be that hospitals, they tend to have higher prices for things that can be obtained cheaper at, say, a freestanding facility. And a lot of times consumers have no idea that if they just went down the street, they would pay much less. And so this is also a big issue, even for people who are insured, because if you might need, say, an MRI, and that may not be covered, or it may have a different copay on your insurance.
Now, if I were shopping around for open heart surgery, brain surgery, I probably wouldn't want the cheapest or even the second cheapest necessarily, but what is the correlation here between price and quality?
So this is a big issue in American medicine, is there's no correlation between price and quality. And so people think because they're going to the biggest name or the most expensive place that somehow they are getting better care. And that may be true, it may not be true. We just don't have good measures of quality in the system to give people that kind of answer.
And what are you hearing from doctors or other providers about this whole concept of crowdsourcing the price?
So we have heard from doctors and some radiologists, and they're actually really interested in the project. And so we're hoping to partner with them more as the project goes on.
What are they? I would think it would be somewhat threatening, you know, because for most, this is a profit center, potentially.
That's correct. So it's interesting. In some conversations I've had, there is a wariness. But I mean, our message is everyone agrees that this marketplace is broken in terms of how well it can work and how well it can function. And so they're actually interested in working with us to help shine a light on this big issue.
And so you chose mammograms first. Just quickly, what other procedures do you anticipate down the line asking people about?
So we're also going to be asking about back MRIs. We'll be asking about colonoscopy, and then one or more procedures after that.
So fairly common procedures that you could potentially get a lot of people to send you information about.
Yes, common procedures and non-emergency procedures. Because obviously, if you've just been in a car accident, you're not going to be shopping, calling the emergency room, asking what their prices are.
Hopefully not. Lisa Aliferis, KQED Health Editor. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Scott.
You can share what you paid for your mammogram at kqed.org/pricecheck. You can also search the database to see the range of prices in your area. And Scott Shafer is back now to join me for a look at what's coming up ahead on KQED. Hi, Scott.
Hi, Twee.
Well, the controllers race, boy, the drama continues. Just 481 votes separate the number 2 and 3 finishers, both Democrats, Betty Yee from San Francisco and John Perez of LA. The recount started Friday in 2 counties. Where does this go from here?
Well, it starts in Kern County. There are 15 counties altogether. There is no automatic recount provision in California like there is in some states. That would be very expensive. It would cost $3 million. So John Perez, the candidate here, can do that, but he has to pay for it, and he gets to pick which counties, which precincts within those counties, and so now it's begun, and it happens sequentially. I spoke this week with the registrar in San Mateo County. They're getting ready, but they can't begin counting until the number 4 county, which is Fresno, is done with their count. So it's all, it's sort of uncharted territory because it's never really been done before on this scale.
Seems like a really convoluted process, and it seems like it might be an unfair process too, something that really favors the wealthier candidate who can afford to pay for a recount.
That's absolutely true. I mean, if you want a recount, you can have it, but you've got to pay for it. In this case, John Perez has over $1 million, $1.5 million left in the bank. Now, some are saying, why didn't he spend that during the campaign? If he had, maybe he would have come in second. But yes, it does. And so I think that's one thing that's, elections they're imperfect. And when they're really close, you see some of the imperfections. And that's what we're seeing now.
And they better hurry because the ballots have to go to print very soon.
They do. Deborah Bowen, the Secretary of State, has to begin getting that voter guide together. And this could drag out for weeks and weeks and weeks.
Let's turn our attention to high tech for a moment. Facebook, there was a recent report that Facebook manipulated its user news feeds to see how their moods might change depending on the types of stories that you see on someone's Facebook page. Virginia Senator Mark Warner this week calling for a federal investigation. What's some of the other fallout?
Well, I think there's just, first of all, a lot of questions. Like, what were they doing? It's kind of creepy that this company, which has kind of a benign reputation, would be doing this, manipulating people's emotions for their own sort of curiosity. What are they going to do with the data? And why did they do it? So I think at this point, it's generating a lot of questions. Investors don't seem to mind. Their stock price has gone up a few bucks since this came out.
All right, and San Francisco is next week. The San Francisco Planning Commission is going to consider changing its policies on chain stores. What's going on with that? Well,
the rules for formula retail, as they call it, were put in place 10 years ago. They've been amended and tweaked and changed, and it's kind of a hodgepodge. And so some people feel, and the city has done an analysis, they found that the way things are now, it's reducing economic activity, it's raising prices because these smaller stores, which people like, aren't as competitive price-wise. And so the Board of Supervisors is going to be voting on a package of changes to that. And it's very controversial because people like the unique character of their neighborhoods, and they don't want a lot of chain stores coming in and changing that.
But in the meantime, there's also the argument for economic growth.
And diversity. The chain stores tend to hire a more diverse workforce.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right, Scott, thank you.
You bet.
And for all of KQED's news coverage, please go to kqednews.org. And just a final note here, next week, we would like you to join us for a special edition of KQED Newsroom. We'll look at hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, and the controversy it's generating in California.
I'm Scott Shafer. Thanks for joining us.
And I'm Thuy Vu. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.